Black girl says, "Driver did it again." Dad checks down there, and it was a day like any other, yet an unsettling tension lingered in the air as Melanie walked through the door. Jason, her father, sat in the living room, the soft hum of the television in the background, watching her closely as she slipped out of her shoes and tossed her backpack into the corner with an uncharacteristic lack of enthusiasm. He frowned, sensing something was off. Normally, the moment she burst into the house, the room would come alive with her chatter about school, her friends, and what she'd learned that day. But today, her silence was a stark contrast to the lively girl he knew. Melanie, just 8 years old, had always been a ball of energy. Her voice would carry from room to room, filling the house with questions, stories, and 1,000 thoughts all at once. But today, as she trudged toward the hallway, she barely glanced in his direction. Jason tried to brush off the unease that had begun to creep up his spine. Kids had their off days, he reminded himself. Maybe she was just tired. But then, as she passed him, he called out casually, "How was school, sweetie?" She paused, her small frame stiffening, but she didn't turn around. "The driver did it again," she muttered under her breath, barely loud enough for Jason to hear. A chill ran down his spine, his brow furrowed. "What did you say?" he asked, but she didn't respond. Before he could press her, Melanie dashed toward her room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, and the door clicked shut behind her. Jason was left sitting in the living room, heart racing, replaying her words in his mind. The driver did it again. What could she possibly mean? His first thought was that maybe it was something trivial, some childish misinterpretation. Kids had wild imaginations after all. Maybe the driver had been late or said something that she didn't like. But as he sat there, the tension in his chest didn't ease. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that something was deeply wrong. He tried to convince himself not to worry, to let it go for now and ask her later when she might be more willing to talk. But it wasn't that simple. He had always prided himself on being able to read Melanie like a book. And right now, the pages were filled with worry. The house felt heavier that afternoon, the usual sounds of play absent, replaced by a silence that gnawed at Jason's nerves. He wondered if Amanda, his wife, had noticed any changes in Melanie's behavior lately. But Amanda was still at work, and Jason decided not to text her yet. He didn't want to cause any unnecessary alarm, not until he had more information. The minutes ticked by slowly as Jason remained on the couch, his thoughts spiraling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Should he knock on her door? Ask her to explain what she meant? No, he decided. She had seemed so uncomfortable, so eager to escape the conversation. Pressing her too hard might only make her retreat further. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Maybe Melanie just needed some time to unwind, to forget whatever had upset her. But Jason knew himself too well. He wouldn't be able to rest until he understood what was going on. As he mulled over his options, the phrase, "The driver did it again," echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain, urging him to act sooner rather than later. That night, as Jason lay in bed beside Amanda, he found it hard to sleep. His thoughts drifted back to Melanie's words, their vagueness gnawing at him. Amanda stirred beside him, sensing his unrest. "Is everything okay?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. Jason hesitated, unsure if he should burden her with his concerns just yet. "It's Melanie," he whispered. "She said something strange today. I'm not sure what to make of it." Amanda turned toward him, her eyes opening a sliver. "What did she say?" "She mentioned something about the bus driver. Said the driver did it again, but she wouldn't explain." Amanda sat up slightly, a concerned frown creasing her forehead. "That's odd. Do you think something happened?" "I don't know," Jason admitted. "She rushed off to her room before I could ask more." Amanda sighed softly, leaning back against the pillows. "Kids say weird things sometimes. Maybe it's nothing, but we should keep an eye on her, just in case." Jason nodded, but deep down, the unease continued to stir. He couldn't shake the feeling that Melanie's comment was a sign of something more serious. Something was happening, and he needed to figure out what it was before it spiraled out of control. The next morning, Melanie seemed a bit more herself, though the usual sparkle in her eyes still seemed dimmer. Jason watched her closely, trying to gauge if her mood had improved. She ate her breakfast quietly, not offering the usual running commentary about her plans for the day. Jason hesitated to bring up the previous afternoon again, deciding to let her be for now. If she felt comfortable, maybe she would tell him more on her own. But as Melanie gathered her things to head off to school, Jason couldn't help but feel a pang of dread. He wanted to ask her again about the bus ride, about the driver, but before he could speak, she was out the door, walking toward the bus stop. As Jason stood at the window, watching her go, a new thought crossed his mind. What if Melanie wasn't the only one who had noticed something strange? Perhaps one of the other parents at the bus stop had seen or heard something. It was a long shot, but it was worth checking out. With a deep breath, Jason made a decision. Today, after Melanie got home from school, he would find a way to get more answers. No more waiting. He needed to know what was really going on. Over the next few days, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with his daughter. Melanie, once a bubbly, carefree child, had grown quieter by the day. The change wasn't drastic, not enough for others to immediately notice, but Jason saw it. He knew his daughter better than anyone, and the subtle shift in her demeanor gnawed at him. When she got home from school, instead of running to him with stories about her day, she now slipped past him, her eyes downcast, barely acknowledging his presence. At first, Jason had thought it was just a phase, something she would snap out of after a few days. But as the week progressed, the change only deepened. Melanie avoided eye contact, something she had never done before. During dinner, she barely touched her food, and when Jason or Amanda asked her about school, she would shrug and change the subject, directing the conversation away from herself as quickly as possible. It was as if she was hiding behind a wall, one that Jason couldn't see through no matter how hard he tried. Jason's concern grew with each passing day. He began to notice how she spent more and more time alone in her room, the door closed, the sounds of her usual games and activities absent. When he knocked and peeked inside, he would find her sitting quietly on her bed, lost in thought, or staring blankly at the wall. The sight made his heart ache. This wasn't like her at all. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Jason couldn't ignore the tension any longer. Melanie picked at her food, her fork making small, repetitive movements as she moved the peas around her plate, but never ate them. Amanda, too, had noticed the change in their daughter's behavior, and the two shared a worried glance across the table. Jason cleared his throat, deciding to address it head-on. "Melanie, sweetie, you've been awfully quiet lately. Is everything okay at school?" His voice was gentle, careful not to push too hard, but there was an undeniable edge of concern. Melanie's shoulders tensed visibly. She didn't look up, her eyes remaining fixed on her plate. "School's fine," she mumbled, barely audible. Jason exchanged another glance with Amanda, who raised an eyebrow, signaling for him to continue. "Are you sure? You've been acting a little different. If something's bothering you, you know you can talk to us, right?" For a moment, Jason thought she might open up. Melanie's hand paused, her fork hovering above her plate. But then she shook her head and muttered, "I don't want to talk about it." Jason's heart sank. Whatever it was clear that she wasn't ready to share. He felt helpless, watching his daughter struggle with something she couldn't or wouldn't put into words. What could be so bad that she wouldn't talk to them about it? That night, as they cleaned up the kitchen after dinner, Jason couldn't keep his worries to himself any longer. He turned to Amanda, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his voice low but tense. "Something's not right. I think it's more than just a phase or a bad week at school. She's avoiding us, Amanda. She barely talks anymore." Amanda, always the more pragmatic of the two, nodded slowly, her brow furrowed in concern. "I've noticed it too. She's not herself. But what could it be? Do you think something happened at school?" Jason shrugged, frustration seeping into his tone. "I don't know. She won't talk to me about it. But I keep thinking about what she said the other day, about the bus driver. The driver did it again. Remember?" Amanda's eyes widened slightly at the reminder, and she turned off the faucet, her hands resting on the edge of the sink. "Do you think that's connected to all this?" Jason hesitated. "I don't know, but it's the only thing she's mentioned that seemed off. I've been racking my brain, trying to figure it out, but I just don't know. Amanda bit her lip, thinking for a moment. Maybe you should try talking to her again, but in a different way. She might feel more comfortable opening up to you if she doesn't feel pressured. Jason nodded, though the idea of confronting Melanie again filled him with dread. He didn't want to scare her, but he also couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Whatever was going on, it was clearly affecting her deeply, and as her father, it was his job to protect her, even if she didn't want to talk about it. That night, as Jason lay in bed, his thoughts refused to quiet. He kept going over the conversations he had had with Melanie in his mind, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when things had started to change. Was it something at school? A fight with a friend? Or was it, as his gut was telling him, something to do with the bus driver? Unable to sleep, Jason got out of bed and made his way to the living room, where he sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out his laptop. He decided to do some research to see if there had been any complaints or incidents involving the bus driver at Melanie's school. He logged into the online parent group for her school district, a forum where parents often shared updates, concerns, and news about the school. Jason scrolled through the recent posts, looking for anything that might hint at issues with the bus driver. But there was nothing. No complaints. No red flags. Nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. It was frustrating, to say the least. He was left with more questions than answers, and the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right grew stronger with each passing moment. The next day, Jason watched Melanie carefully as she left for school, her small figure walking toward the bus stop with her backpack slung over one shoulder. She didn't look back at him like she usually did, didn't wave or smile. It was as if she was pulling away from him, retreating into a world of her own where he couldn't reach her. Jason's heart ached as he stood by the window, watching her go. Whatever was happening, it was hurting his daughter, and he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He had to find out what was wrong, even if it meant confronting a truth he wasn't prepared for. The sun had begun to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the living room as Jason paced back and forth, waiting for the right moment to approach Melanie. His nerves were wound tight. The concern that had been steadily growing over the past few days now, a full-blown anxiety gnawing at his insides. Amanda was in the kitchen, pretending to read a magazine but glancing up every now and then, sharing Jason's unspoken tension. They had both agreed it was time for him to try again, to talk to Melanie, but this time he had to be gentler, more patient. As the minutes dragged on, Jason finally worked up the courage. He made his way down the hall and knocked softly on Melanie's door. "Mel, can I come in?" There was a long pause before he heard her small voice from the other side. "Yeah?" Jason opened the door and stepped into her room, the dim light casting a soft glow across her face as she sat cross-legged on her bed, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. The sight tugged at his heart. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and it took everything in him to keep his voice steady. He sat on the edge of the bed, giving her space, not wanting to crowd her. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing," he began, his tone casual but filled with care. "I know you've been a little quiet lately, and that's okay, but if something's bothering you, I want you to know you can talk to me. You don't have to go through it alone." Melanie didn't respond at first, her fingers fidgeting with the bear's soft fur. Jason waited, not pushing her, just letting the silence hang between them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the bus driver," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. Jason's heart skipped a beat, his worst fears inching closer to the surface. He kept his voice calm, though his pulse raced. "What about the bus driver?" She hesitated, her small shoulders tensing. "He says things that make me uncomfortable." Jason's breath caught in his throat. "What kind of things, Mel?" She shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Just weird things. Like, he tells me I'm pretty, and sometimes he touches my shoulder." Jason's blood ran cold. He could feel his anger rising, but he knew he had to stay calm for Melanie's sake. "When does he do this? On the bus?" Melanie nodded, still not looking at him. "When I'm getting on or off, he always smiles at me, but it's not a nice smile. It's weird." Jason clenched his fists, his mind racing. The driver, the man responsible for getting his daughter safely to and from school every day, was the source of her discomfort. The vague, unsettling comment she had made days earlier now took on a whole new meaning. He swallowed hard, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Has he ever hurt you, Mel? Touched you anywhere else?" She shook her head quickly, her eyes wide. "No, just my shoulder. But I don't like it. It makes me feel yucky." Jason exhaled, trying to steady himself. Relief that nothing worse had happened mixed with a seething rage that anyone would make his daughter feel this way. "You're so brave for telling me this," he said softly. "I'm proud of you." Melanie's eyes finally met his, a flicker of relief in them as if a weight had been lifted from her small shoulders. But Jason knew that weight had only shifted to him now, and he would do whatever it took to protect her. "Mel, I'm going to make sure this stops. Okay? You don't have to ride that bus anymore. I'll drive you to school, and we'll figure this out." She nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. For the first time in days, she looked a little lighter, as if sharing her secret had eased some of the burden she had been carrying. Jason stayed with her for a while longer, talking about other things, letting the conversation drift to lighter topics until she finally seemed at ease. But as soon as he left her room, the weight of the situation crashed down on him like a tidal wave. Jason walked back to the living room, where Amanda was waiting anxiously. "What did she say?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's the bus driver. He's been saying things to her, making her uncomfortable, and he's touched her shoulder a few times." Amanda's face paled, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. "What? Why didn't she tell us sooner?" "I don't know," Jason admitted, feeling the same frustration Amanda was expressing. Maybe she was scared or embarrassed, but she told me now, and that's what matters. We need to do something about it. Amanda nodded, her eyes flashing with anger. "We need to call the school. Report him. This can't happen again," Jason agreed, though his mind was already racing ahead, trying to figure out the best way to handle the situation. He wanted to march down to the bus depot and confront the man himself, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. They had to go through the proper channels, make sure this was handled professionally and thoroughly. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of emotions: anger, frustration, relief that Melanie had finally opened up. But underneath it all was a growing sense of urgency. Jason knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had only scratched the surface of what was happening, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. No one, especially not someone in a position of authority, was going to make his daughter feel unsafe. As Jason lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the thought kept replaying in his mind. He did it again, but now, Jason knew exactly what it was, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. The days that followed Melanie's incomplete explanation were some of the most difficult Jason had ever faced as a father. He had always thought of himself as a protector, someone who would go to the ends of the earth to keep his family safe. But now, for the first time, he felt powerless. His daughter, his sweet little girl, had been subjected to something he couldn't immediately fix, something he hadn't even known was happening until it was almost too late. Jason's anxiety began to build with each passing day. He couldn't stop thinking about Melanie's description of the bus driver, Mr. Harris. That smile she had mentioned, the way he touched her shoulder, it made Jason's blood boil just thinking about it. But what frustrated him most was the fact that he still didn't have all the answers. Melanie had only given him part of the story, and he knew there was more to uncover. He just didn't know how to get her to open up without pushing her too hard. In the meantime, Jason decided to start his own quiet investigation. He began by talking to some of the other parents at the bus stop, striking up casual conversations as he dropped Melanie off in the mornings. Most of them seemed oblivious to anything unusual, chatting about school projects and after-school activities as if nothing was wrong. Jason found himself growing more frustrated with each passing conversation. Was he the only one who had noticed something off? He also reached out to some of the teachers at Melanie's school, hoping to get more information. He asked subtle questions about the bus rides, about Mr. Harris, but again, there was nothing that stood out. The teachers assured him that everything seemed normal, that they hadn't heard any complaints. Jason nodded along, but inside, his anxiety continued to spike. How could no one else have noticed? How could something like this fly under the radar? At night, Jason would sit at the kitchen table, scrolling through the online parent forums, searching for any hint of a similar complaint. But there was nothing. No one else had reported any issues with the bus driver. It was as if this problem existed only in their small, private world, with no one else able to see the cracks that were forming beneath the surface. As the days went on, Jason began to notice subtle changes in Melanie's behavior that only heightened his concern. She had always been a bright, energetic child, full of curiosity and excitement for the world around her. But now, she seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn. She avoided eye contact more than ever, and Jason couldn't help but notice the way she tensed up whenever the bus was mentioned. It was as if the very thought of getting on that bus sent a wave of anxiety crashing over her. Jason watched her closely, his heart heavy with concern. Each morning, as she reluctantly left the house to catch the bus, he felt a knot form in his stomach. He would stand by the window, watching as the yellow bus pulled up and she hesitantly climbed aboard. The sight made him sick to his core, knowing that she was trapped in a situation that he had no control over. And yet, what choice did they have? Until the school could complete its investigation, Melanie had to keep riding that bus, had to keep facing the man who had made her so uncomfortable. The weight of the situation began to take its toll on Jason. He found it hard to concentrate at work, his mind constantly drifting back to Melanie, wondering how she was doing, if she was safe, if the driver was behaving himself that day. His anxiety began to seep into his daily life, making him short-tempered and distracted. Amanda noticed the change, but she was dealing with her own stress over the situation, and the two of them found themselves snapping at each other more than usual. The tension in the house was palpable, and Jason knew that if they didn't get answers soon, it would only get worse. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table in strained silence, Jason couldn't take it anymore. He set down his fork and looked across the table at Amanda, his voice low and tense. "We need to do something. We can't just keep waiting for the school to handle this." Amanda sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know, Jason, but what else can we do? We've already reported it. We just have to trust that they'll investigate it properly." Jason shook his head, frustration bubbling up inside him. "I don't trust that. I don't trust them to take this seriously. What if they don't find anything? What if they just sweep it under the rug and nothing changes?" Amanda looked at him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and concern. "Then what do you suggest? Confront the driver ourselves? Go to the police?" Jason paused, his mind racing. He had thought about both of those options, but he wasn't sure if they were the right moves. He didn't want to make things worse for Melanie by escalating the situation before they had all the facts. But at the same time, he couldn't stand by and do nothing. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just feel like we're failing her, like we should be doing more." Amanda reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "We're doing the best we can, Jason. We reported it. We're watching her closely. That's all we can do right now. We just have to be patient." Jason nodded. Though the knot in his stomach didn't loosen, patience wasn't something he was good at, especially when it came to his daughter's safety. But Amanda was right. They had done what they could, and now they had to wait for the school to take action. But as the days continued to pass without any updates, Jason's anxiety only grew. He found himself becoming more protective of Melanie, asking her more questions about her day, her bus ride, her interactions with Mr. Harris. But every time he asked, she would shut down, avoiding the topic and retreating into herself. It was clear that she was still deeply affected by what had happened, and Jason didn't want to push her too hard, fearing that he might make things worse. But the longer this dragged on, the more Jason felt like he was losing control of the situation. He hated feeling helpless, hated the fact that he couldn't immediately fix this for his daughter. The thought of that man still driving the bus, still interacting with Melanie every day, filled him with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. He had to find a way to protect her, even if it meant taking matters into his own hands. Jason sat by the window, watching as the shadows lengthened across the street. The The bus was late today, later than usual, and that only added to his growing unease. He glanced at the clock, the seconds ticking by with agonizing slowness. Where was she? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the yellow bus appeared down the road, lumbering toward the stop at the corner. Jason's heart pounded as he watched it pull up, the doors opening with a hiss. But when Melanie stepped off the bus, something was different. Her face was pale, her expression tight, as if she were holding back tears. She didn't look around for him, didn't give her usual wave as she hurried toward the house. Instead, she walked straight past him, her small figure tense as she rushed inside. Jason's stomach dropped. He followed her inside, his pulse racing as he called out to her, "Melanie!" No answer. She was already halfway down the hall, heading toward her room. Jason quickened his pace, catching up to her just as she reached her door. "Mel, wait." She froze, her hand on the doorknob, but she didn't turn around. Jason could see the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders were hunched as if she were trying to make herself smaller. His heart ached at the sight. "What happened?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern. For a long moment, there was silence. Jason waited, holding his breath, afraid to push her too hard. Finally, Melanie turned around, and when she did, he saw the tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't want to go on the bus anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jason's heart clenched. He knelt down in front of her, taking her small hands in his. "Why, sweetie? What happened?" Melanie looked down, her lower lip quivering. He looked at me funny today, and he touched my shoulder again." Jason felt a cold chill run down his spine. The vague fears that had been haunting him for days were now taking shape, solidifying into something much more real and much more terrifying. He had hoped, against all reason, that it had been nothing, that Melanie had just misinterpreted something, that there was a harmless explanation for all of this. But now, hearing the fear in her voice, seeing the tears in her eyes, he knew that wasn't the case. His mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to storm down to the bus depot and confront that man. But more than anything, he wanted to protect his daughter. He wanted to make sure she never had to feel this way again. He pulled her into a hug, holding her close as she cried softly against his chest. "It's okay, Mel. You're safe now. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, I promise." But even as he spoke the words, Jason knew that promise wasn't enough. He had to do something. He had to take action. After a few minutes, when Melanie had calmed down, Jason guided her to her room and helped her get settled. He made sure she was comfortable, tucking her in with her favorite stuffed bear, and stayed with her until she fell asleep. Once she was finally resting, Jason made his way back to the living room, his mind churning with anger and fear. Amanda was waiting for him, her face tight with concern. "What happened?" Jason sat down heavily on the couch, running a hand through his hair. "It's the bus driver. He did it again." He touched her shoulder, and she said he looked at her, in a way that scared her. Amanda's eyes widened, her expression shifting from concern to anger. "That's it. We're going to the school. This can't go on." Jason nodded, though his thoughts were already racing ahead, trying to figure out what their next steps should be. Reporting it to the school wasn't enough anymore. They needed to do more. They needed to make sure that man was held accountable. "I'm going to call the school first thing in the morning," Jason said, his voice firm. "But we should also consider going to the police. This isn't just about inappropriate comments anymore. He's crossed a line." Amanda agreed, her voice trembling with anger. "We can't let him get away with this." The rest of the night passed in a haze of tense discussions and phone calls as Jason and Amanda began to put their plan into action. They weren't going to wait for the school's investigation to drag on any longer. They were going to take matters into their own hands and make sure Melanie was safe. As Jason lay awake in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of Melanie's tear-streaked face from his mind. The fear in her eyes, the way she had clung to him, it haunted him. And as much as he hated to admit it, a part of him wondered if there was more to the story, something she wasn't telling him yet, something darker, something that had been building for longer than he realized. But one thing was clear: the bus driver had to be stopped, and Jason would do whatever it took to protect his daughter. By the next morning, Jason and Amanda had already decided their course of action. Jason dropped Melanie off at school himself, making sure she didn't have to take the bus, and then headed straight to the principal's office to report what had happened. He sat down with the school administrators, laying out everything Melanie had told him, his voice steady but laced with barely contained anger. The principal listened carefully, her expression growing more concerned as Jason recounted the details. "This is serious," she said, her voice grave. "We'll begin an investigation immediately. Mr. Harris will be suspended until we can determine what happened." Jason nodded, though the reassurance did little to ease the knot of anxiety in his stomach. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. He needed more than just words. He needed to know that his daughter was safe. That afternoon, when Melanie came home from school, Jason and Amanda sat her down to talk. They knew this conversation would be difficult, but it was necessary. They needed to be sure that nothing else had happened. Nothing that Melanie hadn't told them yet. "Sweetie," Jason began gently, sitting down beside her on the couch, "we need to ask you something, and it's really important that you're honest with us. Okay?" Melanie looked up at him, her eyes wide and anxious. "What is it?" Jason exchanged a glance with Amanda, who nodded, encouraging him to continue. "When you said the bus driver touched you on your shoulder, was that the only time? Or has he touched you anywhere else?" For a moment, Melanie didn't respond. She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt, her small body tense. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for her answer, fearing the worst. Finally, Melanie shook her head. "No, just my shoulder." Jason let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, though it was tempered by the knowledge that what had happened was still unacceptable, still something that had to be dealt with, but at least it hadn't gone further. At least they had caught it before it could escalate. "We're going to make sure this never happens again," Amanda said softly, reaching out to stroke Melanie's hair. "You won't have to see him anymore. And we're going to make sure the school handles this." Melanie nodded, though she still looked uneasy, as if there were more she wanted to say but couldn't find the words. Jason watched her closely, his instincts telling him that there was still something lingering beneath the surface, something she wasn't telling them, but he didn't want to push her any further. Not yet. They had to take this one step at a time. That evening, Jason made another call, this time to the local police. He explained the situation, laying out the details as calmly as he could, though his voice shook with anger. The officer on the other end of the line listened carefully, taking down the information. "We'll look into it," the officer assured him, "but since there hasn't been any physical harm, it might be difficult to pursue charges right away. However, we'll be in contact with the school and conduct our own investigation." Jason thanked the officer, though the response left him feeling unsatisfied. He wanted immediate action, wanted that man removed from his position and held accountable for what he had done. But he knew these things took time, and all he could do now was wait. As the days passed, Jason and Amanda kept a close eye on Melanie, watching for any signs of distress. They made sure she felt safe, driving her to and from school, spending more time with her, reassuring her that they were doing everything they could to protect her. But even as they tried to create a sense of normalcy, the tension in the house remained. There was a heaviness that lingered in the air, a constant reminder of what had happened, of the threat that had come so close to their daughter. One evening, as Jason sat on the couch, his mind still turning over the events of the past week, Melanie came over and sat beside him, her small hand resting on his arm. "Daddy?" Jason looked down at her, his heart swelling with love and concern. "Yeah, sweetie?" Melanie hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "Are you mad at me?" Jason's heart broke at the question. He pulled her into a hug, holding her close. "No, Mel, I'm not mad at you. Not at all. You did the right thing by telling us what happened. I'm proud of you." Melanie hugged him back, her arms tight around his neck. "I was scared," she whispered. "I didn't know what to do." Jason's throat tightened, and he kissed the top of her head. "I know, sweetie, but you're safe now. We're going to take care of this. I promise." As he held her, Jason realized just how much this had affected Melanie, how deeply it had shaken her sense of safety and security. And it wasn't just her. It had affected all of them. Their family had been shaken by this, and now they had to find a way to heal, to rebuild the trust and safety that had been threatened. But one thing was clear: they would get through this together, as a family. And Jason would do whatever it took to make sure Melanie never had to face something like this again. In the weeks that followed, the school's investigation into Mr. Harris intensified. Jason and Amanda had meetings with the principal and other administrators, where they were assured that the school was taking the matter seriously. Other parents had come forward as well, with their own concerns about the bus driver's behavior, though none had spoken up before Jason's report. It seemed that Melanie wasn't the only child who had felt uncomfortable, but for one reason or another, the other parents had kept quiet, perhaps unsure of how to handle the situation, or assuming it wasn't serious enough to warrant action. Jason couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and frustration. On one hand, it was good to know that they weren't alone, that other families had noticed something was off. But on the other hand, the fact that no one had spoken up sooner gnawed at him. How many children had been affected? How long had this been going on? The school acted swiftly, suspending Mr. Harris from his position while the investigation was underway. The local police were also involved, conducting their own inquiry into the situation, though they were careful to manage expectations, explaining that without physical evidence or more concrete allegations, criminal charges might be difficult to pursue. Still, the suspension was a victory of sorts, and Jason and Amanda took some comfort in the fact that the man would no longer be driving the bus or interacting with Melanie or any other children. As the weeks turned into months, life slowly began to return to normal. Jason and Amanda made a conscious effort to be more present with Melanie, spending more time with her, engaging in family activities, and making sure she felt safe and supported. They drove her to and from school every day, no longer trusting the school's transportation system. Even after a new driver had been assigned to the route, Melanie, for her part, seemed to bounce back gradually. The light in her eyes returned, and she began to talk more, to play more, to engage with the world in the way she had before the incident. But Jason and Amanda could tell that there were still moments when she withdrew, when the memories of what had happened lingered in the back of her mind. It would take time for those wounds to heal completely, but they were patient. They knew healing was a process, not something that could be rushed. The experience had changed all of them, in ways both subtle and profound. Jason found himself more vigilant than ever before, not just with Melanie, but with everything. He was more aware of the world around him, more cautious, more protective. He knew that he couldn't shield Melanie from every danger, that he couldn't control every aspect of her life, but he could be there for her. He could watch for the signs, and he could make sure she knew she could always come to him if something was wrong. Amanda, too, became more involved in Melanie's daily life. She volunteered at the school more frequently, attended parent meetings, and made sure to stay informed about what was happening in Melanie's classes and extracurricular activities. They both realized that being present and engaged was one of the best ways to protect their child, to create an environment where she felt safe and supported. As the months passed, Jason and Amanda reflected on how the experience had brought them closer as a family. They had faced a challenge together, and in doing so, had grown stronger. They had learned the importance of communication, of listening to each other, and of trusting their instincts. Jason, in particular, had learned that sometimes the most important thing he could do as a father was to simply be there, to listen, to offer comfort, and to act when necessary. The school, for its part, implemented new policies in response to what had happened. They strengthened their screening process for bus drivers and other staff members who interacted with children, and they established a clearer protocol for reporting and investigating inappropriate behavior. The changes were a small but meaningful victory, and Jason took some comfort in knowing that other children would be safer because of what had happened. But even as life returned to normal, Jason knew that their vigilance couldn't waver. The world was full of dangers, some of them hidden in plain sight, and it was his job to protect his daughter as best he could. He couldn't control everything, but he could be there for her, could make sure she knew she was loved and supported, and could teach her to trust her instincts and speak up when something was wrong. In the end, that was what mattered most. That Melanie knew she was never alone, that her parents would always be there to protect her, and that she had the strength to face whatever challenges life might throw her way. As Jason looked at his daughter, laughing and playing in the backyard, he felt a deep sense of pride and love. They had come through the storm together, and though the scars might never fully disappear, they had emerged stronger, more united than ever before. And for that, Jason was grateful.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.